The dust swirled around Thomas Mackenzie's weathered boots as he guided his horse through the rocky terrain of the Arizona Territory in 1885. The sun beat down mercilessly on his broad-brimmed hat, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Mackenzie had been riding alone for 3 days, searching for his missing cattle that had wandered off during a fierce thunderstorm. At 42 years old, Mackenzie was a man carved from the harsh frontier life. His calloused hands told stories of countless days wrestling with stubborn cattle and mending broken fences. His ranch, the Double M, sat on 500 acres of unforgiving land that he had claimed and fought to keep for over 15 years. The nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away, and the closest town was a hard day's ride through treacherous canyon country. As Mackenzie crested a small hill, he spotted something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, near a cluster of twisted mesquite trees, 7 figures hung from makeshift gallows. Even from this distance, he could see they were women, their colorful Apache clothing fluttering in the desert breeze like tragic flags. His horse sensed his tension and pranced nervously as Mackenzie spurred it forward. The scene that greeted him was worse than he had imagined. The 7 young Apache women, none appearing older than 25, had been left to die in the scorching sun. Their faces showed the unmistakable signs of recent torture, and their traditional dresses were torn and bloodied. Mackenzie had lived on the frontier long enough to know that this was no random act of violence. The Apache people in this region had been trying to maintain peace with the white settlers for months. These women belonged to Chief Running Bear's peaceful band, known for their attempts to coexist with the growing number of ranchers and miners in the territory. Working quickly despite the gruesome scene, Mackenzie cut down each woman, checking desperately for signs of life. To his amazement, he found faint pulses in 3 of them. Their breathing was shallow, and their lips were cracked from dehydration, but they were alive. The other 4 had not been so fortunate. The surviving women were barely conscious, their eyes fluttering open occasionally to reveal the terror they had endured. Mackenzie knew he had to act fast. He had water in his canteens, but these women needed medical attention that was far beyond his frontier first aid skills. As he worked to revive the survivors, Mackenzie noticed something odd about the scene. The ropes used were of high quality, the kind typically used by professional cowboys or military personnel. The gallows themselves were expertly constructed, suggesting this was not the work of angry settlers acting on impulse. This had been planned and executed with cold precision. Moreover, the location was strange. This isolated spot was far from any Apache settlement or major travel route. Someone had specifically chosen this place to send a message, but to whom, and why these particular women? Mackenzie's mind raced as he gently poured water between the parched lips of the youngest survivor, a girl who couldn't have been more than 18. Her dark eyes met his for a moment, and he saw not just pain but a desperate attempt to communicate something important. The rancher had always prided himself on staying out of territorial politics and conflicts between settlers and Native Americans. He minded his own business, treated everyone fairly who came to his ranch, and expected the same in return. But this scene of senseless brutality stirred something deep within him that he couldn't ignore. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Mackenzie made a decision that would change his life forever. He couldn't leave these women here to die, and he couldn't simply report this to the territorial authorities and walk away. Something told him that whoever was responsible for this atrocity had connections that ran deeper than simple frontier justice. Loading the 3 survivors onto his pack horse and covering the bodies of the others with his spare blankets, Mackenzie began the long journey back toward civilization. But instead of heading directly to the territorial capital or the nearest military outpost, he decided to take the women to his ranch first. They needed immediate care, and he suspected that whoever had done this might be watching the official channels. During the slow ride home, Mackenzie found himself thinking about the growing tensions in the territory. Rumors had been circulating for months about a group of influential men who were trying to force all Apache bands off their traditional lands to make way for a massive mining operation. These men supposedly had connections in the territorial government and weren't above using intimidation and violence to achieve their goals. The rancher had dismissed these rumors as frontier gossip, but now he wondered if he had witnessed the brutal reality behind the whispered stories. If that was the case, then saving these 3 women was just the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous confrontation. As darkness fell, and the lights of his ranch house finally came into view, Mackenzie realized that his simple life as an independent rancher was about to become much more complicated. The 3 women clinging to life on his pack horse represented more than just victims of frontier violence. They might be the key to exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial power. The desert night was unusually quiet as Mackenzie approached his home, as if the land itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. He had no way of knowing that his decision to rescue these 7 Apache women would soon place him at the center of a deadly game of politics, greed and survival that would test everything he believed about justice and courage on the American frontier. Mackenzie carried the 3 unconscious Apache women into his ranch house, laying them carefully on blankets spread across his main room floor. His housekeeper, Maria Santos, a middle-aged Mexican woman who had worked for him for 8 years, gasped when she saw their condition. Without being asked, she immediately began heating water and gathering clean cloth for bandages. The youngest of the survivors, who appeared to be around 18, regained consciousness first. Her name was Little Dove, and she spoke broken English mixed with Apache and Spanish. Through her painful whispers and Maria's translation skills, Mackenzie began to piece together a horrifying story. Little Dove revealed that she and the other women had been gathering medicinal plants near Copper Creek when they were surrounded by a group of masked men on horseback. These weren't random raiders or angry settlers. They were well-organized, well-armed, and seemed to know exactly who they were looking for. The leader had called each woman by name before ordering them to be bound and loaded onto wagons. The second survivor, a woman in her 20s named Morning Star, was the daughter of a respected Apache medicine man. When she regained consciousness the following morning, she added crucial details to Little Dove's account. The masked men had taken them to an abandoned mining camp about 30 miles northwest of Mackenzie's ranch. There, they had been questioned repeatedly about the location of something called the sacred cave where the bluestones rest. Mackenzie recognized this description immediately. Local legends spoke of a hidden Apache sacred site that contained valuable turquoise deposits, but according to Morning Star, the cave held something far more valuable than semi-precious stones. Her grandfather had hidden important documents there, papers that proved the Apache people had legal claim to lands that several powerful men wanted for a massive copper mining operation. The third survivor, a quiet woman named Singing Wind, didn't speak for 2 days. When she finally broke her silence, her words chilled Mackenzie to the bone. She had recognized one of the masked men despite his attempt at disguise. It was Samuel Crenshaw, the Territorial Land Commissioner, who had been pressuring Apache chiefs to sign treaties, giving up their ancestral territories. Crenshaw was known throughout the territory as a fair-minded official who claimed to have the Native Americans' best interests at heart. He had built his reputation on negotiating peaceful settlements and avoiding the kind of violent conflicts that plagued other Western territories. Learning that he was involved in torturing and murdering Apache women shattered Mackenzie's faith in territorial justice. As the women slowly recovered their strength, they revealed more details about the conspiracy they had uncovered. A group of wealthy investors from back east had formed a secret partnership with territorial officials to force the Apache people off lands that contained one of the largest copper deposits ever discovered in the Arizona Territory. The partnership included not just Crenshaw but also Judge Harrison Blackwood, Sheriff's Deputy William Harrington, and several prominent ranchers and businessmen. The documents hidden in the sacred cave proved that the Apache people had never legally signed away their rights to these lands. Previous treaties had been forged or signed by men who had no authority to speak for the various Apache bands. If these documents ever reached federal authorities in Washington, the entire mining operation would be shut down, and several powerful men would face federal charges for fraud and land theft. Mackenzie realized that the 7 women had been killed not for revenge or in a fit of rage, but as a cold-blooded message to Chief Running Bear and other Apache leaders. The conspiracy needed the Apache people to believe that resistance was futile, and that anyone who opposed the land grab would meet a similar fate. During the women's recovery, strange things began happening around Mackenzie's ranch. He noticed riders watching his property from distant hills, always staying just far enough away to avoid identification. His cattle were spooked more than usual, and he found evidence that someone had been searching through his barn and outbuildings during the night. Maria Santos reported that men had come to the ranch asking questions about Mackenzie's activities while he was away searching for his cattle. They claimed to be traveling merchants, but their expensive horses and fine clothes suggested otherwise. They had been particularly interested in whether Mackenzie had encountered anyone during his recent travels. The pressure escalated when Deputy Harrington arrived at the ranch with an official territorial warrant. He claimed that 3 Apache women were wanted for questioning in connection with attacks on white settlers near Copper Creek. According to his documents, these women were dangerous criminals who had been raiding supply wagons and threatening peaceful ranchers. Mackenzie knew these charges were completely fabricated. The 3 women could barely walk, let alone participate in raids against armed settlers, but he also realized that turning them over to Harrington would mean their certain death. The deputy's barely concealed hostility and his obvious familiarity with Mackenzie's ranch layout suggested that he was part of the conspiracy. Using his knowledge of territorial law, Mackenzie demanded that the women be given proper medical attention before being moved, and insisted on accompanying them to ensure their safety. Harrington reluctantly agreed, but made it clear that Mackenzie was walking on dangerous ground by harboring potential criminals. That night, Little Dove approached Mackenzie with a proposal that would change everything. She wanted to take him to the sacred cave to retrieve the documents that proved Apache land rights, but getting there would require a dangerous journey through territory now heavily patrolled by the conspirators' men. It would also mean trusting that the documents actually existed and hadn't been destroyed during the months since the conspiracy began. Mackenzie found himself facing the most important decision of his life. He could turn the women over to territorial authorities and return to his peaceful existence as an independent rancher. Or he could risk everything to help expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The choice would determine not just his own future, but the fate of an entire people who were fighting to keep their ancestral homeland. As he sat on his porch that evening, watching the desert stars emerge in the clear sky, Mackenzie thought about his father's words from many years ago. A man's true character isn't measured by what he does when it's easy, but by what he does when doing right might cost him everything he's worked to build. Mackenzie made his decision at dawn. He would help Little Dove retrieve the documents from the sacred cave, but first he needed to ensure the other 2 women were safe. Working with Maria Santos, he arranged for Morning Star and Singing Wind to be hidden at the home of Father Miguel Rodriguez, a Catholic priest who ran a small mission 20 miles south of the ranch. Father Rodriguez had secretly helped Apache families before and could be trusted to protect them. The journey to move the women required careful planning. Mackenzie loaded his wagon with supplies as if making a routine trip to town, while the 2 wounded Apache women hid beneath blankets and feed sacks. They left before sunrise, taking a circuitous route through canyon country that would be difficult for watchers to follow. Father Rodriguez received them without question, his weathered face showing deep concern for the women's condition. The priest had served on the frontier for over 20 years and had seen enough territorial corruption to understand the danger these women represented to powerful men. He assured Mackenzie that Morning Star and Singing Wind would be protected within the sanctuary of his mission. Returning to his ranch, Mackenzie found Little Dove already preparing for the dangerous journey ahead. Despite her injuries, she had regained enough strength to travel, though she still moved carefully and tired easily. She had drawn a detailed map in the dirt outside his barn, showing the location of the sacred cave and the various routes they could take to reach it. The cave was located in the Dragoon Mountains, approximately 60 miles northeast of Mackenzie's ranch. The area was traditionally Apache territory, but it was now heavily patrolled by territorial rangers and private security men working for the mining consortium. Little Dove explained that there were secret Apache trails known only to her people, but using them would require traveling at night and hiding during the day. Mackenzie spent the day gathering supplies for what could be a week-long journey. He packed extra ammunition for his rifle and pistol, knowing they might encounter hostile forces. He also brought medical supplies, food, and water for the long trek through desert country. Most importantly, he brought a camera, a recent acquisition he had purchased to document his ranch operations. If they found the documents, he wanted photographic evidence that couldn't be destroyed or disputed. They left the ranch at midnight, traveling on horseback through terrain that would challenge even experienced frontier riders. Little Dove guided them along ancient Apache trails that wound through narrow canyons and across rocky mesas, where their horses' hooves would leave no tracks. Her knowledge of this country was extraordinary, and Mackenzie found himself developing deep respect for the Apache people's understanding of their homeland. During their first day hiding in a secluded canyon, Little Dove told Mackenzie more about the documents they were seeking. Her grandfather, Chief Stone Eagle, had been one of the few Apache leaders who could read and write English. When territorial officials first arrived with treaties to sign, he had insisted on keeping copies of all agreements and had noted discrepancies between what was promised verbally and what was written in the legal documents. Over the years, Chief Stone Eagle had gathered evidence of repeated treaty violations, forged signatures, and fraudulent land claims. He had been preparing to take this evidence to federal authorities in Washington when he died suddenly under suspicious circumstances. Before his death, he had hidden the documents in the sacred cave, telling only a few trusted family members of their location. The mining consortium had learned about these documents through Samuel Crenshaw, who had been searching territorial records for any potential legal challenges to their land claims. When they discovered that Chief Stone Eagle's evidence could invalidate their entire operation, they began systematically targeting anyone who might know the location of the hidden documents. On their second night of travel, Mackenzie and Little Dove encountered their first real danger. While following a narrow trail along a ridge, they spotted campfires in the valley below where a group of armed men had established a temporary base. Through his field glasses, Mackenzie could see at least a dozen riders and several supply wagons. These weren't territorial rangers on routine patrol, but a private army equipped for serious conflict. Little Dove recognized the area as one of the traditional routes to the sacred cave, confirming Mackenzie's suspicion that the conspiracy had figured out the general location of the hidden documents. They would have to find another way to reach their destination, one that would add at least 2 days to their journey and take them through even more dangerous territory. The detour led them through a section of the Dragoon Mountains known for its unstable rock formations and sudden flash floods. Mackenzie's horse nearly lost its footing several times on loose shale, and they had to lead their animals on foot through particularly treacherous passages. Little Dove's injuries slowed their progress, but she refused to consider turning back. During their third day, while resting in the shade of a large boulder, they were discovered by an Apache scout who seemed to appear out of nowhere. Mackenzie's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol, but Little Dove called out in Apache, identifying herself and explaining their mission. The scout, a young man named Swift Arrow, was part of Chief Running Bear's band and had been searching for Little Dove since she disappeared. Swift Arrow brought disturbing news from the Apache settlements. Chief Running Bear and several other leaders had been arrested on fabricated charges and were being held at the territorial prison. More Apache families were being forced off their lands every day, and those who resisted were being labeled as hostile insurgents. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and time was running out to expose the conspiracy before all Apache. People were either imprisoned or driven from the territory. The young scout also revealed that the conspirators had brought in professional gunmen from Texas and California, men with reputations for solving problems through violence rather than legal means. These hired killers were systematically eliminating anyone who posed a threat to the mining operation, including several Apache leaders who had simply asked questions about the legitimacy of the land. Seizures. Swift Arrow volunteered to guide them to the sacred cave using a route that would avoid the areas being patrolled by the conspirators' men. His knowledge of secret Apache pathways was even more extensive than Little Dove's, and he knew about recent changes in patrol patterns that could help them avoid detection. As they approached the final stretch of their journey, Mackenzie realized that retrieving the documents was only the first step in a much larger challenge. Even if they found the evidence to expose the conspiracy, they would still need to get it safely to federal authorities who could take action. With Chief Running Bear imprisoned and territorial officials compromised, Mackenzie was becoming the Apache people's primary hope for justice in a fight that was growing more dangerous with each passing hour. The sacred cave lay hidden behind a waterfall in a narrow canyon that could only be accessed by climbing down a treacherous cliff face. Swift Arrow had brought rope and climbing equipment, explaining that the Apache people had used this secret entrance for generations to protect their most precious ceremonial objects and important tribal records. Mackenzie felt his heart pounding as he rappelled down the wet rocks beside the thundering waterfall. The spray soaked through his clothes, making the rocks slippery and dangerous. Little Dove, despite her injuries, descended with the grace of someone who had made this climb many times before. Her reverence for this sacred place was evident in every careful movement. Inside the cave, their torches revealed a vast chamber decorated with ancient Apache pictographs and ceremonial artifacts that had been preserved for centuries. The air was cool and dry, perfect for protecting delicate materials from the harsh desert climate. Little Dove led them to a specific section of the cave where loose stones concealed a hidden alcove. Behind the stones, wrapped in waterproof deer hide, they found Chief Stone Eagle's collection of documents. Mackenzie's hands trembled as he carefully unwrapped the bundle, revealing dozens of papers that would revolutionize understanding of Apache land rights in the territory. The documents were meticulously organized and included original treaties, correspondence with federal officials, and detailed maps showing the true boundaries of Apache tribal lands. Most damaging to the conspiracy were Chief Stone Eagle's personal notes documenting meetings where territorial officials had openly discussed forging Apache signatures on land agreements. The old chief had recorded dates, names, and specific conversations that proved a pattern of systematic fraud dating back over 5 years. Samuel Crenshaw's name appeared repeatedly, along with detailed descriptions of bribes paid to federal land office employees. One document particularly caught Mackenzie's attention. It was a letter from a federal Indian agent in Washington warning Chief Stone Eagle that territorial officials were exceeding their authority and that any treaties signed without proper federal oversight would be considered invalid. This letter alone proved that the Apache people had never legally surrendered their rights to the disputed lands. Working quickly by torchlight, Mackenzie photographed every document with his camera, taking multiple exposures to ensure the evidence would be preserved, even if the originals were destroyed. Swift Arrow kept watch at the cave entrance while Little Dove helped translate some of the Apache language portions of the documents. As they worked, Little Dove revealed another shocking detail. Her grandfather had not died of natural causes as everyone believed. She had witnessed Crenshaw and 2 other men visiting Chief Stone Eagle's lodge on the night he died. The next morning, the old chief was found dead with no apparent cause. But Little Dove had seen one of the men force something down his grandfather's throat, while the others held him down. The implications of this revelation were staggering. If Crenshaw had murdered Chief Stone Eagle to prevent him from revealing the conspiracy, then the Territorial Land Commissioner was guilty not just of fraud, but of premeditated murder. This added a new level of danger to their mission, as it proved the conspirators would kill anyone who threatened their operation. Their work in the cave was interrupted by Swift Arrow's urgent whistle from the entrance. A patrol of armed riders had discovered their horses and was searching the canyon. The Apache scout had managed to hide their animals in a side ravine, but it would only be a matter of time before the patrol found the entrance to the sacred cave. Mackenzie quickly finished photographing the documents while Little Dove carefully rewrapped the originals and returned them to their hiding place. The evidence was too important to risk losing during their escape, and the photographs would serve as backup proof if anything happened to the original papers. Swift Arrow reported that the patrol consisted of 8 heavily armed men led by a man matching the description of Jake Morrison, a notorious gunfighter hired by the mining consortium. Morrison was known for his ruthlessness and his skill at tracking fugitives across difficult terrain. If he had found their trail, it would be extremely difficult to escape without a confrontation. The 3 fugitives had 2 options. They could wait in the cave and hope the patrol would move on, or they could attempt to escape using a different route that Swift Arrow knew about, but that would require swimming through an underground river system. The second option was extremely dangerous, especially for Little Dove in her weakened condition. But staying in the cave might mean being trapped if Morrison discovered the entrance. Little Dove made the decision for them. She insisted that they take the underground river route, arguing that protecting the secret of the sacred cave was more important than her personal safety. The cave had been a sanctuary for her people for generations, and revealing its location to enemies would be a betrayal of everything her grandfather had died protecting. The underground river route required them to dive beneath a rock formation and swim through a completely Submerged passage before emerging in a different canyon system. Swift Arrow went first, carrying a waterproof bag containing Mackenzie's camera and photographic plates. Mackenzie followed, and Little Dove brought up the rear despite her injuries. The underwater passage was longer than expected, and Mackenzie's lungs burned as he felt his way through the pitch-black tunnel. Just when he thought he might have to turn back, he saw light ahead and burst to the surface in a hidden pool surrounded by towering canyon walls. Swift Arrow was already there, helping to pull Little Dove from the water when she emerged moments later. They had escaped the immediate danger, but Mackenzie realized their problems were far from over. Morrison and his men would eventually realize that their quarry had vanished and would expand their search throughout the mountain region. More importantly, getting the photographic evidence to federal authorities would require traveling through territory now crawling with hired gunmen and corrupt territorial officials. Swift Arrow suggested they split up to increase their chances of success. He would return to Chief Running Bear's people with news of what they had discovered, while Mackenzie and Little Dove made their way to the nearest telegraph office to contact federal authorities in Washington. The plan was risky, as it meant Mackenzie would be traveling with an injured Apache woman through territory where tensions between whites and Native Americans were at their highest point. As they prepared to part ways, Little Dove gave Mackenzie a sacred Apache token that would identify him as a friend to any Apache people he might encounter during his journey. She also shared the Apache names and locations of other tribal members who could provide assistance if needed. Her trust in this white rancher who had risked everything to help her people was complete, and Mackenzie felt the weight of responsibility for not just her life but the future of all Apache families in the territory. The sun was setting as Mackenzie and Little Dove began their dangerous journey toward civilization, carrying photographic evidence that could expose one of the largest land fraud conspiracies in territorial history. Mackenzie and Little Dove traveled by night across the desert, heading toward the town of Wilcox, where Mackenzie knew there was a telegraph office that could reach federal authorities in Washington. The journey would normally take 2 days of hard riding, but with Little Dove still recovering from her injuries and the need to avoid the main trails, it would take at least 4 days. On their first night of travel, they encountered an unexpected ally. Father Rodriguez appeared out of the darkness, riding hard from his mission with urgent news. Morning Star and Singing Wind had revealed additional information about the conspiracy that changed everything. The mining operation wasn't just about copper deposits. The consortium had discovered that the Apache lands contained one of the largest silver veins ever found in the American Southwest, the Tai. Priest carried a letter from Morningstar detailing conversations she had overheard while being held captive. The consortium's Eastern investors had already sold shares in the mining operation to buyers in Europe, promising returns that could only be delivered if they gained complete control over Apache lands. The fraud was worth millions of dollars, making it the largest financial conspiracy in territorial history. More urgently, Father Rodriguez reported that territorial officials were planning to declare martial law throughout the Apache regions within days. Once martial law was declared, all civil rights would be suspended, and anyone helping Apache people could be arrested as an enemy of the territory. Mackenzie's window for reaching federal authorities was closing rapidly. The priest offered to carry a message to the territorial capital on Mackenzie's behalf, but Mackenzie knew that written reports could be intercepted or destroyed. The photographic evidence needed to reach Washington directly, and that meant he had to complete the journey to the telegraph office himself. Their second night brought new dangers. While crossing a wide valley, they spotted lights from a large encampment that hadn't been there when Mackenzie passed through the area just weeks earlier. Through his field glasses, he could see that it was a military-style operation with dozens of tents and armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Little Dove recognized the location as a traditional Apache gathering place where her people had held ceremonies for generations. The consortium had established their base camp directly on sacred Apache ground, a deliberate insult designed to demoralize the tribal communities and demonstrate their power over Native American traditions. Worse still, Mackenzie could see that the camp was positioned to control all the main routes to Wilcox and other towns with telegraph facilities. The consortium had effectively created a blockade that would prevent anyone from carrying information about their activities to outside authorities. Little Dove suggested an alternative route that would take them through the Chiricahua Mountains, But this path would add 2 more days to their journey, and would take them through territory controlled by Apache bands that might not trust a white rancher, even one carrying the sacred token she had given him. As they debated their options, they were surprised by a group of Apache warriors, who seemed to materialize from the rocky terrain around them. Mackenzie's hand moved toward his weapon, but Little Dove quickly identified herself and explained their mission. The warriors were part of a resistance group led by a young chief named Thundercloud, who had been organizing Apache families to resist the forced relocations. Thundercloud listened carefully as Little Dove described the documents they had found and the evidence Mackenzie had photographed. The young chief's anger was controlled but intense as he learned the full extent of the conspiracy against his people. He had suspected that territorial officials were corrupt, but the scale of the fraud was beyond anything he had imagined. The Apache resistance group offered to provide an escort to help Mackenzie and Little Dove reach the telegraph office. But Thundercloud warned that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. His scouts reported that Jake Morrison and his gunmen were systematically searching every ranch, farm, and settlement in the territory, looking for the missing Apache women and anyone who might be helping them. More troubling still, Thundercloud revealed that Samuel Crenshaw had convinced the territorial governor to issue wanted posters for Mackenzie, claiming that the rancher had murdered several territorial rangers and was leading an Apache uprising against white settlers. The fabricated charges carried a reward of $500, dead or alive. Mackenzie realized that he was now a wanted fugitive in his own territory, unable to seek help from any official law enforcement agencies. His only chance was to reach federal authorities who had jurisdiction over territorial corruption and could override local warrants. But getting to a telegraph office would be like walking into a trap, as Morrison's men would certainly be watching all communication facilities. Thundercloud proposed a desperate plan. His warriors would create diversions at several locations to draw the consortium's forces away from Wilcox, while a small group escorted Mackenzie and Little Dove to the telegraph office through backcountry routes. The plan would require precise timing and would put many Apache lives at risk. But Thundercloud argued that exposing the conspiracy was worth any sacrifice. The operation began at dawn on their 4th day. Thundercloud's warriors launched coordinated attacks on 3 of the consortium's outlying camps, making enough noise and causing enough confusion to suggest a major Apache uprising. As planned, Morrison and most of his gunmen rushed to respond to these apparent threats, leaving the telegraph office in Wilcox lightly guarded. Mackenzie and Little Dove, accompanied by 2 Apache warriors, approached Wilcox through a maze of arroyos and rocky hills that kept them hidden from the main roads. The town was tense with rumors of Indian attacks, and most residents had barricaded themselves in their homes and businesses. The telegraph office was guarded by only 2 men, both of whom appeared nervous about the reported Apache activities in the area. Mackenzie knew he would have to act quickly and decisively, as sending a detailed telegram to Washington would take time, and Morrison's men would certainly return to investigate any telegraph activity. Little Dove and the Apache warriors created a distraction by setting fire to an abandoned building on the opposite side of town, drawing the guards away from the telegraph office. Mackenzie slipped inside and began composing the most important message of his life, a telegram that would expose one of the largest conspiracy in Arizona, territorial history, and potentially save the Apache people from complete displacement from their ancestral lands. As he worked feverishly at the telegraph key, Mackenzie could hear gunshots and shouting from various parts of town. The diversions were working, but he knew that time was running out. Once Morrison realized that the Apache attacks were coordinated diversions rather than random raids, he would figure out that the real target was the telegraph office. The message Mackenzie sent contained specific details about the forged treaties, the murder of Chief Stone Eagle, and the locations where the photographic evidence could be recovered. He included the names of all the territorial officials involved in the conspiracy and detailed information about the illegal mining operation. Most importantly, he requested immediate federal intervention to prevent the declaration of martial law and the continued persecution of Apache families. As Mackenzie finished transmitting the message, he heard horses approaching at a gallop. Morrison and his gunmen had figured out the ruse and were racing back to Wilcox. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Mackenzie's survival would depend on whether the Apache diversions had bought him enough time to get the evidence safely to federal authorities. Mackenzie finished transmitting his telegram just as Jake Morrison and 6 gunmen thundered into Wilcox's main street. The rancher grabbed his camera and the photographic plates, then slipped out the telegraph office's back door as the hired killers dismounted in front of the building. Little Dove and the 2 Apache warriors were waiting with horses in the alley behind the office. As Morrison's men kicked down the front door, Mackenzie and his companions galloped away toward the rocky hills that surrounded the town. Behind them, they could hear Morrison's furious shouts as he realized that his quarry had escaped once again. The chase that followed was unlike anything Mackenzie had ever experienced. Morrison's men were expert trackers and determined killers who knew that allowing Mackenzie to escape would mean the end of their lucrative employment with the mining consortium. They pursued the fugitives through desert country with a relentless intensity that pushed both horses and riders to their limits. For 2 days, the deadly game of cat and mouse continued across the harsh Arizona landscape. Mackenzie's group had the advantage of knowing secret Apache trails, but Morrison's men had superior numbers and fresh horses at various relay points the consortium had established throughout the territory. Several times the pursuers came within rifle range, and gunfights erupted among the rocks and canyons. During one particularly fierce engagement, one of the Apache warriors, a brave young man named Red Hawk, sacrificed himself to allow the others to escape through a narrow canyon passage. His death weighed heavily on Mackenzie, who realized that his decision to expose the conspiracy was costing Apache lives even as it sought to save their people from displacement and persecution. On the 3rd day, everything changed. A contingent of federal marshals arrived in the territorial capital, with orders to investigate the allegations Mackenzie had telegraphed to Washington. The federal response was swift and decisive because Mackenzie's message had reached officials who were already suspicious of territorial land dealings and were looking for evidence of corruption. The federal marshals were led by Deputy Marshal James Harrison, a veteran law enforcement officer with experience investigating territorial corruption throughout the western states. Harrison had brought a team of investigators and enough federal deputies to override any local resistance to their authority. Samuel Crenshaw was arrested at his home before he could destroy evidence or flee the territory. The search of his office revealed additional documents that confirmed Mackenzie's allegations and implicated several other territorial officials in the conspiracy. Most damaging was a ledger that detailed bribes paid to federal land office employees and forged signatures on treaty documents. Judge Harrison Blackwood was arrested while attempting to board a train to California with a suitcase full of gold coins and mining company stock certificates. His arrest caused a sensation in the territorial capital, as he had been considered one of the most respected legal authorities in the Arizona territory. The mining consortium's eastern investors learned about the federal investigation through newspaper reports and immediately began legal proceedings to distance themselves from the illegal activities of their territorial partners. Several prominent businessmen claimed they had been deceived about the legitimacy of the land acquisitions and demanded federal protection from potential lawsuits. Morrison and his gunmen found themselves hunted by federal marshals instead of pursuing Mackenzie through the desert. Most of the hired killers fled the territory rather than face federal charges for their roles in the conspiracy. Morrison himself was captured, trying to cross the border into Mexico, and was brought back to face charges for multiple murders and conspiracy to commit fraud. Chief Running Bear and the other imprisoned Apache leaders were released immediately when federal authorities reviewed the fraudulent charges against them. The chief's first act upon his release was to travel to Mackenzie's ranch to personally thank the white rancher who had risked everything to expose the conspiracy against his people. The meeting between Chief Running Bear and Mackenzie was emotional and historic. The Apache chief presented Mackenzie with a sacred eagle feather, the highest honor his people could bestow on a non-Apache person. He declared that Mackenzie would forever be considered an honorary member of the Apache Nation and would be welcome in any Apache settlement. Throughout the Southwest, Little Dove recovered completely from her injuries and became a key witness in the federal trials that followed. Her testimony about the murder of her grandfather, Chief Stone Eagle, resulted in first-degree murder charges against Samuel Crenshaw. The former territorial land commissioner was eventually sentenced to life in prison for his crimes. The photographic evidence Mackenzie had taken in the sacred cave proved crucial in establishing the Apache people's legal rights to their ancestral lands. Federal courts ruled that all treaties signed without proper federal oversight were invalid, and the Apache bands were granted legal title to over 2 million acres of territory that included their traditional homelands. The mining consortium's operations were shut down permanently, and the company was forced to pay massive compensation to the Apache people for the damages caused by their illegal activities. The compensation money was used to establish schools, medical facilities, and agricultural programs that helped Apache communities transition to the changing conditions of the late 19th century while maintaining their cultural traditions. Mackenzie's role in exposing the conspiracy made him famous throughout the American West, but he refused offers to write books or give lectures about his experiences. He returned to his ranch and continued raising cattle, though he maintained close friendships with Apache families throughout the region. His ranch became a regular stopping point for Apache travelers, and he learned to speak Apache fluently. Morning Star and Singing Wind both survived their ordeal and went on to become leaders in their communities. Morning Star became a teacher who helped preserve Apache language and traditions for future generations, while Singing Wind married Thunder, Cloud, and became an influential voice in tribal councils that negotiated with federal authorities. The conspiracy trials continued for over 2 years and resulted in convictions for dozens of territorial officials and businessmen. The scandal led to major reforms in federal oversight of territorial governments and established legal precedents that protected Native American land rights throughout the western United States. Years later, when Mackenzie was an old man sitting on his ranch porch watching the desert sunset, he would often think about that day when he discovered 7 Apache women hanging from makeshift gallows in the desert. His decision to cut them down and investigate their deaths had changed his life completely, but he never regretted choosing justice over safety. The eagle-feathered chief running bear had given him remained mounted above his fireplace, a constant reminder that courage and compassion could triumph over greed and corruption, even on the harsh frontier of the American West.